The rain hammered against the jagged river stone marking the grave, but Barrett couldn't bring herself to leave. As the lowest omega of her pack, this muddy patch of earth was the only place she felt safe. But the sudden, bone-chilling drop in temperature warned her she was no longer alone. The scent of frost and raw, overwhelming power flooded the clearing. From the shadows of the tree line, massive silhouettes emerged. One by one, 20 towering white wolves, creatures of myth, the elite royal guard, stepped into the rain. They didn't attack. Instead, they completely encircled her father's grave. Then, the Alpha King stepped forward. The Whispering Pines Cemetery lay on the absolute fringes of the Blackwood Pack's territory, a forgotten graveyard for the disgraced and the packless. Barrett Hemlock stood shivering in the torrential downpour, her threadbare jacket offering zero protection against the biting autumn wind. She stared down at the freshly turned earth. There was no headstone for Balthazar Hemlock. As an Omega, who had dragged his daughter into the territory 15 years ago, begging for sanctuary, he had never been afforded the dignity of a proper burial. A simple jagged river stone, placed there by Barrett's bruised hands, was his only monument. Barrett's body ached from the morning's chores. Alpha Dominic, the cruel and unpredictable leader of the Blackwood Pack, had made sure Barrett felt the weight of her father's passing. He was a leech, Barrett, Dominic had sneered just hours prior, shoving a heavy bucket of lye into her hands. Now you carry his debt. You belong to the pack house until you drop. Tears mingled with the cold rain on her cheeks. Balthazar had always been a quiet, broken man, walking with a heavy limp and speaking in riddles about the snow-capped mountains of the north. He had taught Barrett to keep her head down, to mask her scent with ash, and to never, ever look an alpha in the eye. But he was also her entire world, the only warmth in a life of cold servitude. A sudden, sharp snapping of a thick branch echoed through the graveyard. Barrett flinched, instinctively lowering her gaze and dropping to her knees in the mud, assuming Dominic's enforcers had come to drag her back to the kitchens. But the scent that rolled over the damp earth wasn't the musky, damp earth smell of the Blackwood wolves. It was ozone. It was fresh snowfall, sharp pine, and a raw, suffocating aura of dominance that made the air itself feel too heavy to breathe. Barrett dared to lift her eyes, peering through the curtain of her wet, dark hair. Through the dense, foggy tree line, a pair of glowing, ice-blue eyes materialized. Then another, and another. Barrett's breath caught in her throat. The shadows detached themselves from the ancient pines, stepping silently into the clearing. They were massive, easily the size of draft horses, their fur a blinding, immaculate white, even in the gloom of the storm. White wolves were a legend, a genetic rarity tied exclusively to the sterling royal bloodline in the far north. 20 of them fanned out, their heavy paws making no sound against the dead leaves. Barrett scrambled backward until her spine hit the trunk of a dead oak tree. She was paralyzed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 20 apex predators, the Royal Guard. They didn't bare their teeth. They didn't growl. With terrifying precision, the 20 wolves moved into a perfect circle, enclosing Barrett and her father's muddy grave within their ring. Then the pack parted. The wolf that strode through the gap in the circle was a monster of a creature, a scarred, towering behemoth with a coat the color of a winter blizzard and eyes like fractured diamonds. The sheer pressure of his aura forced Barrett's face towards the mud. Her wolf whimpered, entirely submitting to the presence of an alpha whose power dwarfed Dominic's, like a sun dwarfing a candle. Bones cracked and shifted in a rapid, fluid symphony. When Barrett gathered the courage to peek upwards, a man stood where the beast had been. He was breathtakingly lethal. Dressed in dark, tailored clothes that seemed impervious to the rain, he possessed sharp, aristocratic features, an unyielding jawline, and silver-blonde hair slicked back by the storm. Bianca Sterling, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a ruler known for his ruthless efficiency and his absolute isolation. Barrett squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the strike. Intruders on Packlands, especially royalty, meant war. Omegas caught in the crossfire were nothing but collateral damage. But the strike never came. Instead, the sound of heavy boots approached, stopping inches from Balthazar's unmarked grave. Bianca stood in absolute silence, staring down at the jagged riverstone. The heavy rain seemed to sizzle against his skin, driven away by his high body heat. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King lowered himself. His knee sank into the wet mud. Barrett gasped aloud, clapping a hand over her mouth. The king was kneeling. "I am late, Commander," Bianca murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Barrett's chest. "I apologize." Before Barrett could even process the word commander, the chaotic howling of Blackwood wolves shattered the silence. Alpha Dominic burst into the clearing, flanked by 10 of his largest enforcers, including his terrifying beta, Garrett. They were mid-shift, snarling and snapping, having smelled the massive intrusion of foreign wolves. "What is the meaning of this?" Dominic roared, though his voice wavered noticeably as he took in the 20 massive white wolves staring back at him with chilling indifference. When Dominic's eyes landed on the kneeling man, the color drained from his face. King Bianca." "None." Bianca didn't stand. He didn't even look at Dominic. He simply ran a gloved hand over the jagged stone of Balthazar's grave. "You bring an army onto my lands unannounced," Dominic stammered, trying to puff out his chest to maintain face before his enforcers. "This is a violation of the Southern Treaties, and you are trespassing near my pack's property." Dominic pointed a trembling finger toward Barrett, who was still huddled against the tree. "That Omega belongs to me. Her father died owing me thousands. She is bound to my pack house until the debt is paid." Slowly, Bianca stood up. He finally turned his fractured diamond gaze upon Dominic. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 20 degrees. Frost literally began to form on the edges of the gravestone. "Property?" Bianca's voice was perilously soft. Garrett, misjudging the king's quietness for hesitation, took a threatening step toward Barrett. "Get over here, Barrett, now. Don't embarrass the Alpha." A blur of white motion followed. One of the Royal Guard wolves lunged, moving faster than the eye could track. Before Garrett could even scream, 800 pounds of white wolf had him pinned by the throat to the muddy earth, massive fangs resting gently against the beta's jugular. The rest of Dominic's men froze, terrified. Bianca buttoned his dark jacket, his eyes locked on Dominic. "The man buried in this mud, whom you treated as a beggar, was Balthazar Hemlock, former Grand Commander of the Royal Guard. He took a treasonous dagger to the spine 15 years ago to shield a 12-year-old prince." Bianca's eyes darkened, the beast within him surfacing. He sacrificed his name, his rank, and his health, going into hiding to ensure my enemies believed the assassination plot succeeded, allowing me to take the throne. Barrett stopped breathing. Commander? Treason? Shielding a prince? Her father, the limping, quiet man who swept floors, was a royal hero. Dominic took a step back, his bravado entirely shattered. I didn't know." "He never said he was an honorable man. You are a parasite," Bianca interrupted, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You worked a crippled war hero to death, denying him even a proper headstone." Bianca raised a hand. The 20 white wolves stepped forward in unison, the circle tightening. Dominic's enforcers whimpered, lowering their heads in complete submission. "I am here to collect his remains and return him to the capital for a hero's funeral," Bianca announced. Then he finally turned his gaze to Barrett. When his ice-blue eyes met hers, a jolt of electricity violently snapped through Barrett's veins. It was like touching a live wire. Her breath hitched, and her inner wolf, usually a cowering, silent thing, slammed against the forefront of her mind, howling a single, terrifying word. "Mate." Bianca stiffened. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the icy blue of his irises until his eyes were almost entirely black. The Alpha King felt it too, the undeniable, soul-binding pull of the mate bond. For a fraction of a second, the legendary stoic king looked completely unmoored, but Bianca was a master of control. He blinked, the ice returning to his gaze, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. He walked toward her. Barrett tried to press herself further into the tree, her heart thumping wildly. Bianca stopped just inches away and extended a massive, scarred hand. "Balthazar sent a letter to the capital 3 days ago," Bianca said softly. Meant only for her ears, despite the audience. He knew his body was failing. He called in the life debt I owed him. His dying wish was for his daughter's absolute protection from the monsters of this world. I am just an Omega," Barrett whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't belong in a palace." "You are a hemlock," Bianca corrected, his voice firm but surprisingly gentle. "And your father did not merely ask for sanctuary." Bianca turned back to face a pale, trembling Dominic. "Balthazar's debt is immense. A mere place in my pack is insufficient. To legally bind her to my absolute protection, to shield her from the political vipers of my own court who still hunt Balthazar's bloodline, she requires a title." Dominic gulped. "A title? By the laws of the Winter Court," Bianca declared, his voice ringing out over the pounding rain, sealing her fate. "Barrett Hemlock is under my sovereign protection. She leaves with me today, and by the time the winter solstice arrives, I will repay the debt to her father by making her my queen." The silence that followed was deafening. Barrett stared at the hand offered to her, the sheer gravity of his words crushing her. He was doing this out of duty. A life debt to a dead man. But as she placed her trembling, mud-stained hand into the Alpha King's warm grasp, the violent spark of the mate bond ignited between them, a dangerous secret that would either save her in the treacherous royal court or tear them both apart. The journey to the northern territories was a blur of terrifying firsts for Barrett. She had never been inside a vehicle with leather seats, let alone the colossal, sleek black jet that King Bianca Sterling commanded. As the aircraft pierced through the storm clouds, leaving the miserable, rain-soaked lands of the Blackwood Pack behind, Barrett sat rigidly in a plush, oversized seat. She kept her mud-stained knees pressed tightly together, terrified that she might somehow tarnish the immaculate interior of the cabin. Bianca sat across from her. He hadn't spoken since he commanded his guards to secure her father's remains in a specialized, temperature-controlled casket in the cargo hold. The Alpha King was a statue of terrifying, coiled power, his fractured diamond eyes constantly shifting to the window, though Barrett felt the heavy weight of his peripheral gaze tracking her every flinch. The silence was suffocating, thick with the unacknowledged static of the mate bond. Every time Barrett inhaled, her lungs filled with the crisp, intoxicating scent of winter pine and ozone that radiated from him. Her inner wolf, which had spent 20 years beaten into submission, was pacing restlessly in her mind, desperate to bare her neck to the apex predator across the aisle. "You are shaking," Bianca finally said. His baritone voice cut through the hum of the jet's engines. I apologize, Your Majesty," Barrett stammered, instinctively lowering her head. "Do not bow your head to me, Barrett," Bianca commanded, the sudden sharpness in his tone making her jump. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, realizing his volume had frightened her. "A queen does not cower, and you are no longer a servant of Dominic's pathetic regime." "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered honestly, her fingers twisting the frayed hem of her jacket. Bianca leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your father, Balthazar, was the most fearless man I ever knew. When the assassins breached my father's study 15 years ago, they were looking to end the Sterling bloodline. Balthazar took a poisoned silver blade meant for my heart. He dragged himself and you, just a 5-year-old child, into the wilderness to make them believe we had both perished, buying my loyalists time to secure the capital." Bianca's eyes darkened with a turbulent storm of guilt and reverence. "You have his blood in your veins, Barrett. The courage is there. It merely needs to be awakened." Hours later, the jet descended into a sprawling, snow-covered valley, nestled between jagged, impassable mountains. This was Frosthold. The northern capital was a fortress of pale stone and dark glass, surrounded by a dense, ancient pine forest. As they landed, a convoy of heavily armored, black SUVs was already waiting on the tarmac. The transition into the royal estate was overwhelming. Barrett was immediately ushered into the care of Mrs. Gable, a stern but remarkably gentle older woman who served as the head housekeeper. For the first time in her life, Barrett experienced a hot bath drawn in a massive marble tub, filled with soothing oils meant to heal the bruises and cuts that littered her fragile frame. As the layers of ash, mud, and blackwood grime were washed away, something strange began to happen. Her scent changed. Omegas typically smelled of earth or subtle, muted wildflowers. But as Barrett stepped out of the bath and was wrapped in a thick, heated robe, the air in the bathroom grew heavy with the sharp, intoxicating fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and fresh snowfall. An hour later, Barrett sat on the edge of a massive, silk-draped bed in the guest wing. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the royal physician, was carefully wrapping a bandage around a particularly nasty scrape on her forearm. Bianca stood by the door, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his jaw locked in a rigid line. "Her malnutrition is severe, King Bianca," Dr. Pendleton murmured, packing away his silver medical instruments. "But her vitals are stabilizing. However," the doctor paused, adjusting his glasses and glancing nervously between Barrett and the king. "There is an anomaly in her blood work and in her olfactory signature." Bianca went incredibly still. "Explain, Arthur." "Balthazar wasn't just hiding her physically," the doctor said, keeping his voice hushed. "He was dosing her with a synthetic wolfsbane derivative. Very low doses. Just enough to suppress her secondary gender and mask her true scent." Barrett frowned, confusion knitting her brows. "Suppress my gender? But I'm an Omega." "No, my dear," Dr. Pendleton said gently. "You were kept weak by the poison, so you would present as an Omega. Without the toxins in your system, your true nature is surfacing." The doctor looked at Bianca. "She carries the dormant scent of a true Luna. It is an incredibly rare genetic marker. The moment her scent fully develops, every unmated alpha in this hemisphere will be driven into a frenzy to claim her." A low, terrifying growl rattled the windows of the bedroom. Bianca's eyes flashed entirely black. The massive oak door behind him splintered under his grip. The thought of another alpha looking at Barrett, let alone claiming her, pushed the king's legendary control to its absolute breaking point. No one will touch her," Bianca snarled, his voice distorted by his wolf. He looked at Barrett, his chest heaving, the mate bond screaming at him to cross the room and mark her right then and there. But he forced himself to step backward into the hallway. "Rest, Barrett. The real war begins tomorrow." Over the next 3 weeks, Inarn, the golden cage of Frosthold, revealed its thorns. While Barrett was treated with physical reverence by the staff, the political climate of the Winter Court was venomous. The northern elite were scandalized by the sudden arrival of a mysterious, unpedigreed woman who was meant to be crowned their queen. Leading the opposition was Lord Harrison Whitmore, the incredibly wealthy and influential Minister of Defense. Whitmore had spent the last decade grooming his daughter, Lady Genevieve, to be Bianca's bride. Barrett's presence was a direct insult to his grand design. Barrett spent her days in a grueling crash course of survival. She was taught the intricate etiquette of the Northern Court, the history of the Sterling bloodline, and, most importantly, how to conceal her emotions. As the trace amounts of her father's poison finally left her system, Barrett underwent a shocking physical transformation. Her dull, brittle hair turned into thick, lustrous dark waves. Her skin glowed, and the frail, broken posture of a battered servant was replaced by an innate, undeniable regal grace. But it was her newly awakened scent, jasmine and snow, that caused the most chaos. She was required to wear specialized, scent-blocking medallions at all times when leaving her quarters to prevent the palace guards from becoming entirely distracted by her presence. The tension culminated just days before the winter solstice gala, the event where Barrett was to be officially introduced to the kingdom. Barrett was in the solarium, practicing formal introductions, when Lady Genevieve Whitmore sauntered into the room. Genevieve was a striking, lethal-looking woman, with icy blonde hair and a permanent sneer. She was flanked by two of her own guards. "So this is the street rat our king insists on parading before the court," Genevieve mocked, circling Barrett like a vulture. "Tell me, Barrett, how exactly did your father manipulate the king? Blackmail? Or did you simply offer him services more suited to a brothel than a throne room?" Before Barrett could process the insult, Genevieve accidentally knocked a heavy, scalding silver teapot off the table, sending a spray of boiling water directly toward Barrett's face. 15 years of dodging Dominic's fists took over. Barrett's dormant wolf, finally awake and healing, flared to life. With unnatural, blinding speed, Barrett stepped aside, catching the heavy silver teapot by its handle in midair, before a single drop could burn her skin. She set it gently back onto the table, her pulse steady. Genevieve's eyes widened in sheer shock. That was not the reflex of a weak Omega. "I am a hemlock," Barrett said, her voice surprisingly steady, echoing the words Bianca had spoken in the graveyard. "My father gave his life for this crown. I suggest you tread carefully, Lady Genevieve, lest your disrespect be mistaken for the treason your family seems so fond of skirting." Genevieve paled, turning on her heel and storming out of the solarium. Barrett let out a shaky breath, her knees trembling slightly as the adrenaline faded. She hadn't realized Bianca had been watching from the arched doorway until he stepped into the light. "You handled that brilliantly," Bianca said, though his face was drawn and tense. He stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin, sending a violent shockwave of warmth through her body. Barrett looked up at him, her heart aching. "Why are you doing this, Bianca? Really, a life debt explains my rescue. It does not explain a marriage. You are throwing your kingdom into political turmoil for a stranger." Bianca dropped his hand, his jaw clenching. He turned and paced towards the grand windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains. "You are not a stranger, Barrett. I knew the moment my eyes met yours in that muddy graveyard." Barrett's breath caught. "You knew what?" "That you are my fated mate," Bianca confessed, his voice a low, rough whisper that seemed to tear from his throat. He turned back to face her, the absolute vulnerability in his fractured diamond eyes, stealing the breath from her lungs. "The bond hit me with the force of a freight train. Every instinct I possess is screaming at me to claim you, to lock you away where no one can ever hurt you again." "Then why?" Barrett stepped toward him, deeply confused. "Why haven't you told anyone? Why haven't you told me?" "Because you have spent your entire life as a prisoner to the whims of an alpha," Bianca said fiercely, crossing the room to stand over her. He didn't touch her, though the restraint was visibly agonizing for him. "Your father hid you because the people who tried to kill me 15 years ago are still embedded in my court. Lord Whitmore is the primary suspect. If they know you're my fated mate, my one true weakness, they will not just try to embarrass you. They will try to slaughter you." Bianca took a deep, shuddering breath, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I declared you my queen, to give you legal immunity and the protection of the royal guard. But I will not force a mate bond on a woman who has never known a single day of freedom. You will marry me to satisfy the court and secure your safety. But I will not claim you, Barrett. Not until the day you truly want me, as a man, and not as a savior." Before Barrett could process the immense weight of his sacrifice, the heavy oak doors of the solarium burst open. Dr. Arthur Pendleton rushed in, his face ashen, clutching a silver goblet. "Your Majesty," the doctor gasped, breathless. "The elderberry wine prepared for Lady Barrett's dinner tonight. I caught a servant trying to dispose of it in the kitchens." Bianca instantly stepped in front of Barrett, shielding her with his massive frame. "Report, Arthur." "It was laced, sire," the doctor said, holding the goblet up with trembling hands, "with highly concentrated liquid wolfsbane, the exact same strain used on the dagger that struck Balthazar 15 years ago." The temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. Frost aggressively crept up the glass windows of the solarium. The war Balthazar had died trying to escape had finally caught up to them. Bianca let out a deafening, monstrous roar that shook the very foundations of Frosthold. The hunt for the traitors had begun. The Winter Solstice Gala was not merely a seasonal celebration. Within the treacherous, hyper-competitive hierarchy of the Northern Territories, it was a theatre of war masked in terrifying opulence. The Grand Hall of Frosthold had been transformed for the evening into a glittering, breathtaking cavern of ice and silver. Massive, cascading chandeliers, crafted entirely from enchanted northern frost, hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fractured light over the hundreds of aristocratic wolves in attendance. Below the glittering lights, the lords and ladies of the Winter Court mingled, dressed in silks and velvets, sipping elderberry wine from crystal flutes. Yet, beneath the polite laughter and the sweeping orchestral music, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The Northern Court was a den of political vipers, and tonight they were sharpening their fangs, waiting for their fiercely private king's mysterious, unpedigreed new bride to stumble and bleed. Barrett stood hidden behind the massive, intricately carved mahogany doors leading into the upper balcony of the hall, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She was practically unrecognizable from the bruised, mud-soaked girl who had huddled in the Whisper Pines cemetery just weeks ago. Adorned in a sweeping, breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk that moved like liquid water, the fabric was heavily embroidered with silver thread, mimicking the frost of the mountains. Draped over her shoulders, held by clasps of pure diamond, was the heavy, ancient mantle of the Sterling Queens, a garment that had not been worn in nearly a century. Bianca stood rigidly beside her, looking every inch the god of war he was reputed to be, poured into a tailored, obsidian tuxedo that only accentuated the lethal breadth of his shoulders. His fractured diamond eyes were scanning the microscopic gaps in the wood of the doors. "Dr. Pendleton," Bianca murmured, his deep baritone rumbling in the quiet antechamber. "Remove it." The royal physician stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he reached toward the delicate silver chain around Barrett's neck. With a soft click, he unfastened the specialized scent-blocking medallion she had been forced to wear since her true nature began to surface. Barrett gasped softly as the cool metal left her skin. Instantly, the heavy, intoxicating fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and fresh snowfall bloomed in the small space, vibrant and aggressively potent. "They will try to break you tonight, Barrett," Bianca whispered, turning to her. He reached out, his large, calloused, heavily scarred hand gently engulfing her smaller one. The electric shock of the mate bond flared instantaneously between them, a grounding, violent spark of warmth that instantly steadied her chaotic heartbeat. They will whisper. They will stare. Let them look. You are Balthazar Hemlock's daughter. You carry the blood of a hero and the soul of a queen. You belong at the absolute apex of this kingdom. "I am ready," Barrett whispered, squeezing his fingers, drawing strength from the unbreakable, mountainous presence of the Alpha King beside her. Bianca gave a sharp nod to the two towering white wolves standing guard. The heavy mahogany doors swung open inward, the herald, standing at the precipice of the sweeping glass staircase that led down to the ballroom floor, struck the base of his ceremonial staff heavily against the marble. The loud, resounding crack silenced the orchestra and the hundreds of guests in an instant. Presenting His Majesty, King Bianca Sterling, and his betrothed, Lady Barrett Hemlock. A hushed, venomous silence fell over the grand hall as Bianca and Barrett stepped into the light and began their descent down the sweeping, transparent staircase. The aristocracy turned their collective gaze upward, their eyes sharp and critical, ready to dissect the king's newest weakness. But then, Barrett's unmasked scent hit the floor of the ballroom. It did not drift. It crashed over the crowd like an atmospheric tidal wave. The potent, dizzying wave of night-blooming jasmine and fresh, ozone-laced snowfall aggressively flooded the senses of every werewolf in the room. Absolute, unadulterated chaos erupted in the silence. Gasps echoed sharply through the cavernous room. Crystal wine flutes shattered against the marble floor as hands went slack. Across the ballroom, high-ranking alphas physically stumbled backward, clutching their chests as their pupils violently dilated in sheer biological shock. The air grew impossibly heavy. The legendary scent of a true Luna, a genetic myth whispered about in nursery rhymes and ancient historical texts, was suddenly suffocating the room, demanding absolute reverence from the beasts hiding beneath the tailored suits and ball gowns. Standing near the royal dais, Lord Harrison Whitmore looked as though he had been struck by a physical blow. The incredibly wealthy and influential Minister of Defence staggered, leaning heavily on his silver cane. Beside him, his daughter, Lady Genevieve, turned a sickly shade of pale, her arrogant sneer dissolving into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. A true Luna could not be politically manipulated, bullied, or sidelined. Worse, her presence naturally fortified her mate, granting the reigning king an almost invincible level of strength and pack loyalty. Whitmore's meticulously crafted, decade-long plot to usurp the throne was crumbling before his very eyes in the span of 30 seconds. Bianca, ignoring the stunned, reeling aristocracy, guided Barrett to the exact center of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd with lethal, calculating precision. At his subtle nod, the terrified orchestra conductor scrambled to raise his baton. A slow, hauntingly beautiful string waltz began to play. Bianca pulled Barrett seamlessly into his arms. As they moved across the floor, perfectly synchronized, the aristocratic court scrambled to part around them like the Red Sea, terrified to even brush against the hem of her midnight blue gown. Bianca looked down at her, the ice in his eyes melting into a fierce, burning possessiveness that made Barrett's breath catch in her throat. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, there were no assassins, no politics, and no debts. There was only the heat of his hand on her waist and the intoxicating rhythm of their shared bond. But the peace was a fragile, shattered illusion. Midway through the waltz, a loud, grating, horribly familiar voice echoed from the main entrance of the hall. "This is a farce! A masquerade built on the lies of a thief and a runaway!" The music screeched to a halt in a chaotic discord of scraping bows. Barrett froze in Bianca's arms, her blood instantly turning to ice in her veins. She knew that voice. It had haunted her nightmares for 15 years. Standing at the grand entrance of the ballroom, looking wildly out of place in a cheap, poorly fitted suit, was Alpha Dominic of the Blackwood Pack. But he was not alone. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries wearing unmarked tactical gear, their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of silver broadswords. Dominic's face was flushed with manic, greedy triumph as his eyes locked onto Barrett. Bianca immediately placed Barrett firmly behind his massive frame, shielding her from Dominic's view. The Alpha King's canine teeth instantly elongated, his lips pulling back in a terrifying, monstrous snarl. "You have exactly 3 seconds to explain why you have breached the gates of my fortress, Dominic, before I tear you limb from limb and mount your head on a spike at the border." Dominic flinched at the king's lethal tone, but he puffed out his chest, stepping further into the hall. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger toward Barrett. She is no lady. She is a runaway debtor. I was contacted by Lord Whitmore. He graciously paid off her father's massive debt to my pack and legally purchased her labor contract. She belongs to the Whitmore estate now. She is a low-born Omega, a contracted slave, and you, King Bianca, are parading her before your betters as our queen." The court erupted in a fresh wave of outraged, panicked whispers. Lord Whitmore stepped forward from the dais, his silver cane clicking sharply against the floor. The panic had vanished from his face, replaced by a smug, desperate, and triumphant smile. He knew he could not defeat a king bonded to a true Luna in the long run, so he was accelerating his endgame to tonight. "It is true, Your Majesty," Whitmore announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the farthest corners of the room. "I conducted an independent investigation into your so-called bride. She is a fraud, and according to the ancient, irrefutable laws of the Winter Court, a king who intentionally mates with a contracted pack slave soils the royal bloodline and instantly forfeits his crown to the Minister of Defense. You orchestrated the assassination attempt on Balthazar Hemlock 15 years ago," Bianca growled, his voice no longer a human baritone, but the echoing, monstrous rumble of an enraged alpha beast. The temperature in the room dropped so violently that the ambient moisture in the air instantly froze, falling as real snow upon the guests. "And when you discovered he survived, you tried to poison my mate 3 days ago. You brought this pathetic, mud-crawling southern alpha into my home to legitimize your pathetic coup." "I brought him here to legally expose a weak, compromised king," Whitmore roared, his patrician facade finally breaking. He dropped his silver cane, the metal clattering loudly against the marble. It was the signal. Instantly the horrifying trap was sprung. The mercenaries Dominic had brought in drew their weapons, but far worse, a dozen members of the perimeter guard, wolves wearing the royal crest, who were secretly loyal not to the crown, but to Whitmore's incredibly deep pockets, suddenly drew heavy, mechanized crossbows from beneath their ceremonial cloaks. Total, blinding chaos exploded in the grand hall. The loyal members of the White Wolf Guard, stationed strategically around the room, realized the betrayal a fraction of a second too late. They shifted instantly, their human skin tearing away as massive 800-pound white beasts materialized, roaring and tearing into the traitorous ranks. Aristocrats screamed, diving beneath banquet tables as silver blades flashed under the fractured light of the chandeliers. But Whitmore had meticulously planned the crossfire. His primary target was not the king, but the source of his invincible strength. From the upper balcony, a corrupted sniper aimed a heavy crossbow directly at the dais. The weapon fired with a sharp, lethal thwack. Barrett barely registered the sound over the screams of the crowd. A heavy silver bolt, its wicked, barbed tip dripping with highly concentrated, glowing green liquid wolfsbane, tore through the air, aimed flawlessly at Barrett's heart. Bianca did not hesitate. He didn't even have time to shift. Relying purely on his supernatural reflexes and his overwhelming instinct to protect his mate, the Alpha King threw his massive body violently in front of Barrett. The heavy silver bolt slammed into the thick muscle of Bianca's right shoulder with a sickening, wet crunch. The Alpha King let out a deafening, earth-shaking roar of pure agony. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy bolt drove him backward, but it was the liquid wolfsbane that was catastrophic. The undiluted poison, designed to instantly shut down a werewolf's nervous system and rot their cells from the inside out, flooded directly into his bloodstream. Bianca's legendary strength vanished in an instant. His massive legs buckled, and the invincible king of the Northern Territories crashed heavily to his knees on the polished marble floor. The heavy, sickening thud of King Bianca Sterling's knees hitting the polished marble floor echoed louder than the clash of steel and the snarls of shifting wolves. For a fraction of a second, the entire grand hall seemed to hold its breath. The invincible Alpha King of the North, the beast who had ruled with an iron fist and absolute, terrifying control, was suddenly grounded, gasping for air. Protruding from the thick muscle of his right shoulder was a silver crossbow bolt. But it wasn't the silver that was bringing the behemoth down. It was the viscous, glowing green liquid rapidly spreading from the entry wound. Highly concentrated liquid wolfsbane, the same necrotic poison that had slowly killed Barrett's father, Balthazar, over 15 agonizing years, now delivered in a lethal, undiluted dose straight to the king's bloodstream. "Bianca!" Barrett screamed, the sound tearing from her throat with a ragged, primal edge she didn't know she possessed. She dropped to her knees, her heavy midnight blue silk gown pooling in the creeping frost as she caught his massive, slumping frame. His skin, usually radiating a comforting, intense heat, was rapidly turning ashen and freezing cold. Sickly black veins were already spiderwebbing up the thick cords of his neck, branching out toward his jawline. His fractured diamond eyes, normally so sharp and unyielding, were blown wide, his pupils blown out in sheer physiological shock. "Barrett!" Bianca rasped, his massive, scarred hand weakly gripping the fabric of her dress, trying desperately to push her behind him, even as his body failed. "Run! Get behind, Commander Hayes!" But there was nowhere to run. The Grand Hall had descended into absolute, bloody anarchy. Lord Harrison Whitmore's hired mercenaries and the corrupted perimeter guards had formed a deadly ring around the dais. The loyal White Wolf Guard, led by the towering Commander Hayes, were fighting with brutal, desperate ferocity, their pristine white coats already stained crimson, but they were severely outnumbered, forced to protect the screaming, panicked aristocrats of the Winter Court who were scrambling wildly for the locked mahogany doors. Above the din of the slaughter, a dark, grating laugh cut through the air. Alpha Dominic of the Blackwood Pack stepped forward, his cheap suit stained with the blood of a fallen palace servant. He looked down at the dying king and the terrified young woman holding him, his face twisted in a mask of manic, greedy triumph. "Look at this," Dominic sneered, pacing slowly towards them, his heavy boots crunching on the shattered ice of a fallen chandelier. "The great king of the north, brought low by a southern dog and a runaway whore. You thought you could march onto my territory, disrespect my pack, and steal my property without consequences." Dominic spat on the marble near Bianca's boots. "Lord Whitmore paid me triple her father's debt. I'm not just taking her back to the kitchens, Bianca. I'm going to make sure she breeds a whole new line of obedient little Omegas for my enforcers." Lord Whitmore stepped up beside Dominic, leaning elegantly on his silver cane, though his hands trembled slightly with the adrenaline of his treason. "The king is dead," Whitmore announced, his voice magically amplified to project over the sounds of combat. "By the ancient laws of the Winter Court, a ruler who falls in battle without an heir forfeits the crown to the Minister of Defense. Drop your weapons, Royal Guard. Surrender now, and you will be spared." Some of the lesser nobles, paralyzed by fear, actually began to lower themselves to the ground, preparing to submit to the usurper. Barrett knelt in the center of the chaos, clutching the dying king to her chest. She could feel the erratic, failing thud of Bianca's heart against her palms. The black veins had reached his cheekbones. He was suffocating, his inner wolf crying out in agony as the wolfsbane severed their connection. 15 years of running. 15 years of hiding her scent in ash, scrubbing floors with lye, bowing her head, and swallowing the bitter taste of fear. Balthazar had died a slow, miserable death to ensure that she lived. He had sacrificed his pride and his body to protect her from this exact moment, from these exact men. And now, the man who had risked everything to honor that sacrifice, the man who had looked at her not as a broken servant, but as a queen, was dying in her arms. Something inside Barrett's chest snapped. It wasn't a quiet fracture. It was a violent, seismic rupture. The mental dams that her father's low-dose poisons had built over a decade, the psychological barriers that kept her convinced she was nothing but a weak, subservient Omega, instantly disintegrated into dust. She looked at Dominic's gloating, repulsive face. She looked at Whitmore's arrogant, patrician sneer. The fear evaporated. In its place, a blinding, white-hot, absolute fury ignited within her blood. It was a power so ancient and vast that her human frame felt like it might tear apart, trying to contain it. Barrett gently laid Bianca's head against the cold marble floor. "Dr. Pendleton," Barrett commanded. Her voice didn't scream, but it possessed a strange, resonant frequency that cut cleanly through the cacophony of the battle. The royal physician, who had been pinned behind an overturned ice sculpture, scrambled forward on his hands and knees, his medical bag dragged behind him. He looked absolutely terrified, his eyes darting to the armed mercenaries. "My lady, the poison is too concentrated. It's in his pulmonary artery. He needs a massive, untainted blood transfusion. But we don't have the equipment, and there isn't time." "Keep pressure on the wound," Barrett ordered. Her voice eerily calm, devoid of all panic. She stood up. She didn't shift. The legend of the true Luna didn't require fangs or claws to subjugate a room. Barrett closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the ozone-laced air, and tapped directly into the primordial well of power dormant in the Hemlock bloodline. When Barrett opened her eyes, her irises were no longer their usual warm hazel. They were glowing with a terrifying, ethereal, liquid silver light. A physical shockwave of pure, unadulterated dominance erupted from her body. It didn't expand like a bomb. It rolled over the grand hall like a suffocating, atmospheric tidal wave. The heavy scent of night-blooming jasmine and fresh snowfall, which had been a pleasant fragrance merely an hour ago, suddenly intensified 1,000-fold, becoming a physical, crushing weight in the lungs of every werewolf in the room. The atmospheric pressure plummeted. The remaining enchanted frost chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling violently exploded, showering the room in harmless, glittering snow. Every glass window along the eastern wall shattered outward simultaneously. The effect on the hostile alphas was instantaneous and catastrophic. Dominic, who had been mid-stride, let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, and he was violently slammed face-first into the marble floor as if a massive, invisible hand had grabbed him by the back of the neck. He lay there, twitching, his inner wolf whimpering in complete, involuntary submission to the apex predator that had just awakened. He couldn't lift a single finger. The dozen mercenaries hired by Whitmore dropped their silver crossbows and broadswords. The weapons clattered loudly against the stone. The hardened killers collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads, screaming in agony as their internal hierarchy was aggressively overwritten by the sheer, crushing gravity of the true Luna's aura. Even Lord Harrison Whitmore, a high-ranking alpha of the old blood, staggered backward. He dropped his silver cane, his hands flying to his throat as he struggled to draw a single breath. The smug arrogance melted from his aristocratic features, replaced by a mask of supernatural terror. He looked at Barrett, his eyes wide, finally realizing the catastrophic mistake he had made. The myths were real, and he had just tried to murder her mate. The 20 white wolves of the Royal Guard, unhindered by the Luna's aura, which organically distinguished between loyalty and treason, did not hesitate. Commander Hayes let out a deafening roar, his massive white wolf lunging forward. Within 30 seconds, the suppressed mercenaries were disarmed, incapacitated, or dead. Blood pooled darkly on the pristine, snow-dusted floor. Barrett ignored the carnage. The silver light in her eyes blazed fiercely as she turned her back on the broken traitors. She dropped back to her knees beside Bianca. Dr. Pendleton was weeping, his hands covered in the king's blackening blood. "He's fading, my lady. His pulse is practically gone. The wolfsbane is shutting down his organs." Bianca's chest was barely moving. His lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. "He is my mate," Barrett snarled, the primal possessiveness of her awakened wolf taking the reins. It wasn't a plea. It was a universal law she was laying down in the blood-soaked room. She grabbed Bianca's cold, ashen face between her hands, entirely ignoring the toxic black veins that felt like burning ice against her palms. She didn't have time for a medical transfusion. She had to use the only conduit she had left. Barrett leaned down, her dark hair falling like a curtain around them, and pressed her lips fiercely against the dying king's. The physical contact was the key. The moment their lips met, Barrett violently, forcefully ripped open the ethereal mate bond that connected their souls, the bond that Bianca had so carefully tried to keep shielded to protect her. She didn't just open it, she flooded it. Barrett poured every ounce of her newly awakened, untainted, potent lunar energy directly into his failing system. It was a terrifying, agonizing process. Barrett gasped against his mouth as she felt the icy, burning venom of the wolfsbane pushing back against her power. It felt like swallowing broken glass and freezing water simultaneously, but she refused to yield. She imagined her father's quiet strength, the roaring fire of the royal guard, and the desperate, vulnerable look in Bianca's eyes when he had confessed his love in the solarium. She pushed harder, driving her sovereign energy into the darkest corners of his dying cells. The raw power of their fully completed two-way bond acted as a supernatural catalyst. A blinding flash of heat suddenly radiated from Bianca's chest. The king arched his back, a guttural, earth-shaking roar vibrating against Barrett's lips. The black, necrotic veins on his neck began to violently hiss and recede, literally burning away beneath his skin as Barrett's dormant strength systematically hunted and purged the poison from his blood. The color rushed back into his face. The gaping wound on his shoulder, where the silver bolt had struck, began to knit together with unnatural, terrifying speed, the combined healing factor of an Alpha King and a true Luna overriding the physical damage. Bianca gasped, a massive influx of air filling his massive lungs. His eyes snapped open. The fractured diamonds were no longer clouded with death. They were blazing with renewed, feral life, completely entirely swallowed by the jet black of his fully surfaced wolf. The bond was irreversibly sealed. Bianca sat up with a sudden, explosive burst of kinetic energy, pulling Barrett up with him. He completely ignored the blood, the shattered glass, and the hundreds of staring aristocrats. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor, burying his face deep into the crook of her neck. He inhaled her potent scent of jasmine and snow, a rough, desperate sound tearing from his chest. "You claimed me," Bianca whispered roughly against her skin, his voice thick with a mixture of absolute awe, relief, and burning devotion. Barrett wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, burying her hands in his silver-blonde hair. Her heart hammered against his, perfectly synchronized. "You are mine, Bianca Sterling," Barrett replied, her voice steady, echoing through the silent, wrecked ballroom. "And absolutely no one touches what is mine." Bianca lowered her to her feet, though he kept one heavily muscled arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He turned to face the room. The lethal, cold calculus of the Alpha King had returned, supercharged by the presence of his bonded Luna. Lord Whitmore was still on his knees, shivering uncontrollably, his pride utterly shattered. Alpha Dominic remained unconscious in a pathetic heap near the dais. "Commander Hayes!" Bianca's voice boomed, carrying the absolute weight of a god rendering judgment. The massive white wolf shifted seamlessly back into his human form, bowing deeply. "Yes, my king." "Take Lord Whitmore, Alpha Dominic, and anyone left breathing who raised a weapon against the crown to the lowest levels of the frost dungeons," Bianca commanded, his fractured diamond eyes locked onto Whitmore's terrified face. "Ensure they are kept alive. They will face the king's justice and the Luna's wrath at dawn." "With pleasure, sire," Hayes snarled, gesturing for his remaining guards to drag the traitors away. Bianca looked out over the remaining nobles of the Winter Court, the politicians and aristocrats who had whispered behind Barrett's back, who had mocked her origins, and who had stood idly by while usurpers tried to steal the throne. As one singular entity, without a word being spoken, the hundreds of aristocratic wolves in the Grand Hall fell to their knees. They pressed their foreheads to the blood-stained, frost-covered marble. It was not a bow of political courtesy. nor was it a submission driven purely by fear. It was an act of absolute religious reverence. The debt was repaid. Balthazar Hemlock's sacrifice had not been in vain. His daughter was safe, elevated far above the mud and the cruelty of her past. But more importantly, the long, fractured winter of the Northern Territories was finally over. The Winter Court finally had its king, and he stood unbreakable beside his queen. What an absolutely explosive finale. Barrett went from a terrified, bullied outcast to the most powerful true Lunar the Northern Territories has ever seen, saving her king and completely destroying the traitors in one fell swoop. The way she commanded the room and claimed Bianca to cure the wolfsbane poison was incredible. Did you expect Lord Whitmore to team up with Barrett's old abuser, Dominic? Let me know your favorite twist in the comments below. If you loved this epic, suspenseful journey of Barrett and King Bianca, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow werewolf romance lovers, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. We have so many more thrilling, heart-pounding werewolf dramas coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one.